this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
More than 132,000 Allied troops landed on the Normandy beaches on the 6th of June 1944. Through their efforts, the tide of the war turned for the final time to favour the Allies. But how did the Allied army get to the shores of Normandy? The contribution of landing craft to D-Day is often overlooked. To correct this oversight, I'm joined by Andrew Whitmarsh. Andrew has worked as a curator in military history museums for over 25 years, latterly as the curator of the D-Day story in Portsmouth. Outside of his day job, he's also the author of D-Day Landing Craft, How 4,126 Ugly and Unorthodox Allied Craft Made the Normandy Landings Possible. Welcome, Andrew. Now, there are a plethora of landing craft used on D-Day, so I thought we'd start by looking at a few. Firstly, those assault craft that hit the beach in the first waves that are so synonymous with D-Day. I suspect many people will not be aware that there was the LCVP, which is the American Higgins boat, and the British had the LCA, which is Landing Craft Assault, which I tend to think gets overlooked. Let's start with the LCA. Did the British have the LCA before the war? Was it in production? I think it was in production before the Higgins boat, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So during the war, and obviously we're talking about multiple Allied countries here, so the war from the British point of view in 1939, 1945, the LCA, the British version, or the British equivalent, there's a small number produced even before the Second World War has begun for the British, whereas the LCVP is developed as the war goes along, and actually there's several predecessor versions that effectively are evolving from a version that has no ramp. It's one of the early ones to one that does have a bow ramp, but it's a bit narrower than on the LCVP, and then the LCVP, which is the one that people are probably more familiar with. And confusingly, well, all kind of little landing craft carrying troops are sometimes called landing craft infantry, but then that's is a separate type of landing craft. One of the slightly awkward aspects of talking about this subject is very quickly you end up in massive acronyms, and it's a bit hard to avoid that because it's even more complicated if you describe all the landing craft in full. So it kind of just goes with the territory, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I think it's fascinating because I think it demonstrates the complexity that the planners have to deal with when you're having to deal with the landing craft and how they all are so very, very different. Or not. Well, they all have different purposes, but they're doing slightly different things and presumably operating in different ways.
But actually, one of the things that really struck me when I, in the earlier stages of preparing the book and doing the research of the book, is we're all used to this concept that D-Day was the most extensively planned operation ever, and the enormous resources that went into it and all that kind of thing. We're all really familiar with that story. You'd sort of think from that therefore, at some point fairly early on, some planners said, like, what landing craft do we need? Okay, let's develop the best types, or not necessarily the ultimate best, but the ones that are good, suitable for doing all these different roles. Okay, well, we want 1,000 of them, we want 500 of them. And it's actually almost the reverse. There's a number of landing craft that are made for a different purpose, effectively, but then they're used because the Allies need so many landing craft, they have to use everything that's available. And then also there's a case of, well, a lot of examples of the Allies almost sort of to slightly sort of make light of it, kind of making it up as they go along. And as that deadline is approaching for the planned date for D-Day, just making use of whatever they've got. To come to the first thing that I mentioned, so landing craft being designed for one purpose and then use something different. So a good example is the LCIS, in brackets, S, landing craft infantry small. So this was a wooden landing craft with not a lot of armour on it, could carry something like 100, I forget the exact number, but 100 or so troops, and was particularly used for landing the commanders on D-Day. And originally it'd been designed for stealthy raids on enemy beaches, not for an assault role. When they're actually used, they actually ended up having more of an assault role, or facing a lot more fire than had really been envisaged. But they're really not designed for any role where they're being shot at. So they're not particularly well protected. They have unsealed fuel tanks. They have a ramp that came down either side of the bow, like their sort of big brother, the LCIL. So troops descending those are quite vulnerable to enemy fire. The actual ramps are vulnerable to sort of being knocked off and damaged, so they can't be used. But the Allies don't have the luxury of saying, "Oh, this type aren't quite right. We won't use them. We'll use something better."
And presumably, if the ramps are shut off, the troops are left to either jump overboard because it's shallow enough, or scramble as best they can down scramble nets into, depending on presumably where you are in the boat, the water could be quite deep at the back of, if the net's got up towards the rear, which won't help. So I'm intrigued by the Higgins. I find the Higgins boats, the LCVP, the LCA. What's the difference between them? What strikes me is that Britain as a naval power projects her naval power around the world, dropping troops off. We have Gallipoli, and it's still so late. It's late. It's only at the start of the war we start having landing craft. It seems to be amazing that anyone's really got round to thinking of a small craft to come ashore, drop the front down, and everyone runs off. What are the differences between the two craft, between the British and the American version?
From a very sort of general level, they're actually quite similar. There are quite a lot of differences in design, but in terms of size and the role are actually pretty similar. The LCA, the British landing craft, was really designed for making raids. So there's another similarity here. Landing craft designed for one purpose and used for another purpose. So, for example, they had very quiet engines, which, just what you need for sort of sneaking into a beach in the dead of night. They also designed a lot more armour, not just on some armour on the sides, but also overhanging armour. So the troops on board had 3 rows of benches. So that was a plus compared to the LCVP, where you just have to sit on the floor. If you're on the benches on either side, the armour actually overhang slightly over the troop compartment. So that gave a bit of protection. So if you were, landing on a beach and being fired on from above, that would definitely be useful. One of the different aspects of the LCVP is it relied on its engine for keeping the bow of the landing craft pointing to the beach, so its engines had a lot more power compared to the LCA, whereas the LCA had what a lot of landing craft had, which was an anchor at the stern at the rear. So the kedge hook, it's often referred to, certainly by the British, that as you approach the beach, you drop that anchor. It's attached by a cable to the landing craft, and then when you want to come off the beach, as well as reversing the engines, you're also hauling the craft off with that anchor, which also helps keep it with the bows pointing towards the beach, because the risk is if you swing to the side, it'll what's called broaching to, it'll basically get blown side on to the beach, and therefore will quite possibly get sort of battered and not be able to get off. So that was slightly different approaches. And if you read the wartime reports, particularly the Americans don't like the LCA, and there's lots of comments in American reports saying these craft just aren't seaworthy, because there's examples of them, and one of them is there were LCAs carrying the Rangers to Point du Hoc, for example, and several of those craft, one example people may well have heard of, several of those craft get swamped before they've even got to the point. And then the British, I'm not sure they're quite so sort of cutting or disliking of the LCVP, but certainly in the way they use it on D-Day, don't use it, the LCVP in the assault role. But what people may not really know about is how many LCVPs were used by the British in what the build-up flotillas, as they're called, so that would arrive later on D-Day or even on subsequent days, and then help to unload the larger ships.
The LCA gets overlooked. And what is it, 2,000 LCAs are made, whereas it's 23,000 LCVPs are made. So it's no wonder to some extent why the LCA gets overlooked. But we also have the LCT, which is the landing craft tank. Now, what amazed me is this is designed in 3 days, and is it ordered? Churchill asks for it in 1940, the height of the Battle of Britain. He's suggesting that we have a landing craft tank.
It's one of many different things that Churchill has said to have had a hand in. So I think it's probably overclaiming to say that he kind of was the godfather of the LCT or something like that. And clearly lots of things that ideas that he had or he promoted were actually perhaps not the most strategically advantageous ones. But one of his skills was clearly having a finger in lots of pies and knowing when to keep on pressing things and kind of pushing people to keep on developing. So, which I think is probably fair to say that he did for the LCT. But it was a need that other people were aware of. It wasn't solely his idea. The need was to put tanks on a beach early, or tanks or other vehicles, but particularly tanks, I guess, on the beach really early on the first day of the landings. At one point, people were thinking about using quite small landing craft, so you could put one tank in one landing craft. That would generally mean those landing craft would be too small to cross a significant body of water, so the LCT could cross a much longer body of water. And when in these early days, when, for example, the first types of LCT are being developed, this is before the plan has really coalesced, so it's not even definite that the landing is going to be in Normandy, for example.
I couldn't work out why he's asking for it in the summer of 1940. Is he expected to evacuate somewhere else or invade somewhere else? It's sort of weird thing to pop into his head in the middle of the Battle of Britain. Well, so let's have some landing craft tanks.
Well, I think it's a bit like how around a similar time, he wants the commandos established. He's thinking multiple steps ahead. So he's not just thinking, which obviously is definitely what he should have been doing, not just thinking of the immediate situation, but thinking, well, if we get, or when we get through this next stage, what will we need in the future? We'll need the ability to raid enemy coasts, and then further in the future, actually make larger landings. As I say, exactly what he ought to have been doing.
And what I am completely I just find it fascinating as well. It's from the LCT, the DD, which is those floating tanks with the canvas sides come up. They would launch off the LCTs. Now, this is fascinating to me because the idea of a tank launching off something into water, they're not going to be graceful Olympian swimmers diving into the sea. How on earth does a 30-ton tank launch off an LCT?
There were extra channels fitted to the bow door, to the ramp of the LCT, so that the tank could get clear. I think particularly so the propeller at the back of the tank could get clear of the ramp and not sort of catch it as it came off. But yeah, and there must have been a lot of prayer involved, you imagine, even if people weren't religious.
You could see none of the crew sitting in the tank, but rather sitting on it. It's the idea of this thing that just sort of drives off. I don't know how much they had to sort of plop into the water, what the fall was, or does that bow ramp allow them to gracefully slide into the water, or is it literally they drive off the ramp and it's plop and let's hope the canvas stays up?
I think the ramp could be angled so that you'd be entering the water at a sort of fairly decent angle rather than dropping off some depth into the water. Yeah,
it just sounds frightening to me. Now, to add, as you say, this is just an acronym city. So on top of the LCT, we've got the LST, which I hadn't quite appreciated. They're two different things, which is landing ship tank. So what's the difference between the LST and the LCT?
So LST being landing ship tank, as you say. So to sound like I'm trying to be clever, one is a ship and one is a landing craft. But talk in terms of the number of vehicles that they could carry, for example. So an LCT, well, there are different marks of LCT, so it's a bit hard to give one single, well, you can't really give one single figure. And also it depends on what the size of the vehicles, and they all carry different mixes of vehicles, including lots that weren't tanks, really importantly. You could say one of the larger types of LCT could carry about 10 tanks, just to give an example, whereas an LST could carry about 55, up to about 55 vehicles, and about 20 or a bit more than 20 tanks. So key part of the difference is that an LST landing ship tank has 2 decks. It's much larger as well, of course. If you want a kind of sort of modern equivalent, it's a bit like a cross-channel ferry, which, working in Portsmouth, I see regularly. So that's my sort of comparison. I know not everyone's in that situation. So they have a lower deck that could carry heavier vehicles, and then either an elevator on the later ones, a ramp to go up to an upper deck, which only the lighter vehicles could go onto. But because they were much larger, they were obviously a much more tempting target, or a more valuable target, or a greater loss if the whole LST was lost. Although it was an advantage having one vessel carrying more, and also being able to cross a greater distance of ocean. The disadvantage was that you couldn't use them right at the start of D-Day. There's actually a few LSTs that arrived quite early and carrying ducks. So they're a few miles off the beach. They launch the ducks that swim in, and some of those are carrying ammunition, for example. Some of them are carrying, certainly I think it's on the American beaches, are carrying artillery. So it's a field gun actually on the duck, which if you kind of form a mental picture of that, it went about as well as you imagine that might do. And not a lot of those made it to shore, sadly. And then a lot of the LSTs are towing rhino ferries, which is essentially a really large pontoon or sort of floating platform that has its own power, so it has its own engines. There are also little versions of the rhinos that were rhino tugs that would help propel them. And basically, this was something that the LSTs could unload their vehicles onto, and then that would go the last couple of miles into the beach and kept the LST safe out at sea.
Could the LST beach? Was it shallow drafted enough to beach?
Yeah, they were. So they were designed to be able to do that. If it was suitably loaded so that it wasn't carrying too heavy a load, it could beach and unload directly onto the beach, but also it could flood certain tanks. So this is not tanks, the vehicles, but water tanks, in the ship, so that it could had enough draft so that it could actually operate at sea successfully. And a lot of the LSTs go out to the Pacific, for example, so they're making even longer crossings or journeys. The ones used in Normandy are pretty much all made in the US, so then they're crossing the Atlantic, and a lot of them crossing the Atlantic with one of the American-designed LCTs, the landing craft tanks, on their deck, because the LCTs were just too small and too unseaworthy, essentially, to make a really long ocean crossing. So they had to sort of piggyback often on the backs of the LSTs.
I mean, we have literally thousands of craft use. What I'm intrigued by is certainly those smaller infantry landing craft, the LCVPs, the LCAs. Where are they all being built? Because presumably British construction yards are under threat from bombing. They'll also be no doubt busy producing, I presume, heavy shipping for the Battle of the Atlantic. And I assume that those smaller craft, if you build them in the States, they're probably awkward. They'll be awkward to ship because they'll be bulky. So if you're building literally thousands of these things, where are they being built?
So the smaller British built craft are built in lots of different places. They had the advantage they could be built in fairly small factories, so they didn't need a massive shipyard to build them in. So there's the LCM landing craft mechanized, which is slightly larger than an LCA, but not huge. So some of those were built in places like by railway yards, places like that as well. And there were lots of landing craft built in the UK and in all sorts of different places. Then for the American equivalents, a lot of the LCVPs were built in New Orleans, which is where Andrew Higgins, the designer, where his factory was, and would have been brought over on various ships crossing the Atlantic.
They're just stacking them up and shipping them over on tremendous amount of transport space, using them when we're short of transport space. Yeah,
I think often you could have the holes of a ship full, and then you just put a sort of, as you say, stack some landing craft on top of that on the upper deck. So I don't know whether maybe sometimes they wouldn't have been necessarily taking up a huge amount of space that wasn't going to be used for anything else. It's
a typical British way of decentralising the building process to let's utilise small parts of the country that we need for the war effort, rather than Higgins Industries with that massive factory just producing one after the other.
I think one of the really fascinating things for me anyway about the American construction is the inland shipyards. And we were talking about the LSTs just now, which are really substantial ships. A lot of them were built really far inland, either on the Great Lakes or up some of the really large rivers like the Mississippi and other rivers. So they can be literally hundreds of miles from the sea. They were often known as cornfield shipyards, which I think meant that they were in not necessarily literally that there was a field that they built a shipyard in, but sometimes not far from that, but in states that were known for agriculture, and they would literally pick a bit of land at the edge of a river, build a shipyard, and then be churning out these LSTs, which would then have a long journey down this big river to get to the sea. I just find it fascinating how the US was able to use one of its advantages as both a huge amount of space, which in the UK we didn't have, and also a large population, which in the UK you find that as we're getting closer to D-Day, the government is literally having to think, well, do we put personnel into building ships and other equipment, or do we put them into the armed forces? And there just weren't enough. Well, obviously there were enough to send some to both, but it was a matter of weighing up the priorities for do we send a few more to industry, or do we send a few more to actually to the armed forces? There's quite a lot of scraping around to find those landing craft crews.
Presumably as well, that's why those manpower problems were why the peak production of British landing crafts, weirdly, in September 1940 to March 1941, because presumably they're focusing on that, and that's before they move off to focus on something else. For some reason, they must have had capacity to produce landing craft in that period, or that Churchill's frowning on them and they want more landing craft.
Yeah, and I think then the Battle of the Atlantic, the needs of the Battle of the Atlantic really, take over either for building escort warships or for building more merchant ships, and that means that the landing craft production does drop off a bit.
So when it came to planning the operation, so they start in sort of May 1943. What I find interesting, the US planners thought they wanted 4,000 landing craft. The British planners 8,000 landing craft. Why do the British think they need twice as many, and how many do they actually use in the end?
There's a huge number of different plans before it gets to Operation Neptune, which is obviously the one that's eventually used. And within any of those particular plans, so some plans are for different sets of circumstances, but within any of those particular plans, there's different sort of versions that involve different numbers of landing craft. And actually, planners were calculating how many landing craft they needed. There's all sorts of factors like how many vehicles you judge that you can cram onto a landing craft that carries vehicles. Serviceability rates, for example. So you're not simply saying we need this many landing craft. You say we need this many serviceable landing craft. What's the serviceability rate? In other words, how many can we expect to be under repair or on maintenance on D-Day? So therefore, we need more landing craft than we'll actually use in order to have enough that are actually able to be used. So there's a huge number of different numbers. And actually, maybe we'll come to firming up the plan and increasing the number of beaches from 3 to 5. But you asked about the number of landing craft. So in the title of my book, I put the subtitle, which includes the number 4,126 landing craft. And so the reason I'm laughing is anyone who knows a bit about landing craft, and I know there's definitely some people out there who do as well as me, will probably start twitching at this point. But I put a bit more fairly early on in the book that kind of looks at this number because it's an important thing. Just a few things to mention that you'll find other numbers for total number of landing craft. So that's the number given in the British official history. So different aspects of why that number is not quite as simple as it might first seem. So one is that it's only for Operation Neptune. So that's up to the end of D-Day to the end of June. Obviously, the Battle of Normandy went on for longer. So there's some that come along after that date, for example, as replacements. Clearly, they were part of the Normandy campaign as well, but then not included in that number. That number actually is landing ships and landing craft. So that includes LSTs, for example, which, if you're being picky, aren't technically landing craft because there's the clues in the name, they're landing ships. But even at the time, people sometimes included them in landing craft in the sort of numbers. It also includes what the British called LSIs, landing ship infantry, which are basically big troop transports that could carry lots of smaller landing craft on their sides. It includes rhino ferries that I mentioned earlier that would be often towed by LSTs, which again aren't really landing craft, but were closely associated with them. So they're all amphibious vessels, you could say, and also included landing barges, which I think is really important to mention because, again, they often get overlooked. Compared to the rest of the Navy or the Allied navies, I think landing craft were the ugly duckling. Compared to the landing craft, the landing barges maybe were the equivalent sort of ugly duckling that sort of gets overlooked, and because they were even less like a proper warship than a landing craft might be. So a lot of them, they generally were converted civilian river barges, so they could mostly go under their own power, but they weren't designed for an assault landing. They were, a lot of them, to unload bigger ships off the coast of Normandy. So that number 4,126 is not the only number you could use, and it kind of comes with an asterisk and then a page or two in the book just to go into that in a bit of detail. I started off at one point hoping that I could with a big spreadsheet or developing a big spreadsheet and hoping I could come to the answer of how many landing craft there were in the whole operation. But I've concluded if you really dislike someone, ask them to figure out that number, because it'll drive you mad, basically.
Your series of caveats to what you've included and excluded, it'll just make the number contentious from the start.
But it's good in exploring that. It sort of brings in a number of different angles to the story, which I guess is the silver lining.
I did wonder if the British had sort of said, "Oh, we need twice as many landing craft as you Americans think," and they're saying this in sort of 43 as a way of a potential excuse for them to kick the invasion can further down the road.
I'm not sure that was the reason, but there were plenty of other occasions when, from the American point of view, that's what the British were doing. They were saying, "Oh, we're not quite ready yet. Conditions aren't quite ready yet," and that actually leads to the Americans then sending in certain periods, sending a high proportion of their newly built landing craft to the Pacific. There's this weird situation where officially the Allies have this strategy of Germany first, i.e. defeat Germany first and then turn to the Pacific and defeat Japan. As soon as the US enters the war, that's not really feasible. So there's right from the start, there's an element of kind of keep both plates spinning. But then when the British seem to be showing a bit of reluctance to commit to a landing to what would become known as D-Day, then the Americans start sending more resources off to the Pacific. But in fact, throughout 1942, 1943, there's a sort of cycle where the Allies don't quite have enough resources to launch D-Day. They haven't quite enough landing craft. There's not enough troops, American troops in the UK, or things like that. So they can't launch D-Day immediately. So rather than keeping all those forces intact, they then some of them get used or get sent in other campaigns, other theatres, the Mediterranean or the Pacific. So then that makes D-Day even further away or at least before the forces are ready. So it's another case where sort of surface value, you see the years leading up to D-Day, and you can imagine a sort of, if it was plotted on a graph, a kind of smooth curve of gradually increasing strength, and it's a lot more ups and downs in the process.
You picture it as a linear build-up, don't you, for D-Day? And it sounds like a nice straight line, but it doesn't, because everything leading up to D-Day has different priorities. So presumably when they do Sicily, they will need a different landing craft which are going to be used. So you'll get splurges of production of one thing and not another. And then we need this for that. So can you just do this, that? And so all the time, it's not this linear build-up of everything. It's kind of, we've got a lot of this now. We've not enough of that. And
if you've got troops sitting on a beach somewhere under attack, it's pretty hard to say, "Oh, we can't allow you to have these landing craft or landing ships," or "We've got to take them away from you now because of this operation in the future," the plans for which are still a bit vague. But I mentioned just now about as D-Day gets a lot closer and as the Allied commanders were appointed, the number of beaches is increased from 3 to 5, which I think is quite a significant aspect of the whole sort of planning situation. As people probably know, in 1943, there's the Cossack plan. Before the Allied commanders appointed, the planners are only allowed enough landing craft or to take into account enough landing craft to land on 3 beaches, even though they know that's not enough. That's not enough to put a strong enough force ashore. You need more beaches to have make a bigger problem for the Germans, to put more troops ashore simultaneously, etc., etc. So really, almost everyone knows this. It's just that they're not allowed to plan on 5. And then when Eisenhower and Montgomery in particular are appointed, they look at the plan and both have simultaneously the same opinion of it, is that the force needs to be much larger. And so this is quite a well-known part of the story of D-Day, isn't it? Of the planning for D-Day. But the thing that had never really struck me until I started writing the book is, from the Army's point of view, that wasn't a big deal, because all it meant that for any particular unit, you'd be maybe going ashore in Normandy a week earlier or 2 weeks earlier or whatever it was than you would have been otherwise. But from the Navy's point of view, the Allied navies together, this comes at a point at the end of 1943 when just to land 3 divisions ashore or on 3 beaches, the Allied navies have been really scrabbling around and finding it really, really difficult just to have enough landing craft to be confident of landing on 3 beaches. And now suddenly, in early 1944, there's 2 more beaches added. And that's quite different from the Army, where they just change the timetable, because obviously the Navy needs enough landing craft to land whatever that proportion is. But anyway, on 5 beaches, not 3 beaches. So it's a really significant increase at the last minute. And there's a long period of, or certainly would have felt long for planners, when it's not clear whether it's going to be 3 or 5. So they have to develop or run the multiple plans simultaneously, not knowing quite how it's going to plan out. So yeah, you have to feel for them with such uncertainty, definitely.
When it came to planning, how difficult then when you go to 5 beaches, you already haven't got enough landing craft, so you're going to have to utilise everything you can. How difficult was it to deal with the logistics of the different technicalities of all the landing craft you suddenly got to use across a multiple of beaches, which presumably all have slightly different characteristics? Or do they sort of just hand wave that away and everyone was just sort of expected to? Because you've got to get people at the right place at the right time, but certain things will go different speeds to that. And so you've got a whole a large set of vehicles that you somehow have all got to get working together from a planner's point of view.
Yes, and you've got the Army planners and the Navy planners. So obviously the Army have their wishes in terms of the sequence of units they want to land. And then the Navy told them what landing craft that were available. Yeah, so then you had to try and fit those units into those available landing craft, often dividing up units rather than landing a whole unit all at once. But the first time that the Allied armies tried this, they basically messed up or rode roughshod over the Navy's unit structure, which would have made commanding all those landing craft much harder. So there was a bit of kind of reining in the Army. The Army are very keen on effectively on overloading landing craft, and minor details like that. And so from the Army's point of view, they probably thought, well, what's the big deal about overloading a landing craft? It's a little bit over, but hey, we can get away with it. But what it would have meant was that the landing craft would have sat deeper in the water. So therefore, couldn't get so far up the beach. So you're landing the troops or the vehicles on board in deeper water. And if they're vehicles, that might be water that's so deep that the vehicles can't actually get ashore. So what might seem like kind of just playing around with the edges of the rules from the Army's point of view could actually be a really major have a really major effect on whether the landings might work.
There are wonderful pieces of minutiae that the planners have to sort of deal with. That you could see it being quite. You sit down with a blank piece of paper, go, "This is going to be easy," and then you start asking questions, and other people, and before long, you just sitting there with your head in your hands, going, "There's so many variables we have to contend with."
And you mentioned all of the arrival times, normally that kind of thing. So you had different convoys crossing starting out at lots of different places in the UK. So obviously different starting points for different distances to where they're going. Different convoys moving at different speeds. So they were obviously different types of landing craft had a whole range of different speeds, but really mostly just slow and fast convoys. So they were grouping different ships and landing craft together so they were a comparable speed, and they obviously having to go at the speed of the slowest in the convoy. And then they had to be timed so they'd leave at the right time to then arrive at the right beach, because you didn't want the landing craft arriving too early and then just essentially just taking up too much space and getting in the way of the craft that needed to be heading ashore. But equally, you didn't want them arriving late, because obviously they'd all been timed to arrive to perform a particular role, whether that was landing a particular group of troops or, for example, we haven't mentioned is the fire support landing craft, which played an important role. Where they had guns or rockets, they needed to be there in enough time to then support the troops before they went ashore, and also to be there afterwards as well. So yeah, it is an amazingly complex plan, so that the planners are definitely unsung heroes.
Andrew, we're going to hold it there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Andrew Whitmarsh, and we're discussing the landing craft on D-Day. The smaller landing craft, how do they get them, because they're not ocean going, how do they get them to France? Were they towed, or are they carried on something else? I presume the troops don't go in the craft. They must have to mount. That's probably not what they do. Embark at sea, presumably. Yeah,
so that's what was done for certainly troops, or most of the small craft that were landing troops earlier on D-Day. They were carried on davits on the sides or sometimes on the decks of much bigger ships. And then, depending on the particular type of landing craft and the particular ship, either they could be loaded when the craft was actually still hoisted up on the ship's side, so that was relatively easy to get into, or you might have to lower the landing craft into the water, and then the troops have to climb down rope ladders or the rope nets down the side of the craft. And because the ship and the landing craft were affected in different ways by the seas because they're different size, the landing craft would be bouncing up and down, and you'd have to choose the right moment to leap into the landing craft when it was, I suppose, coming up to meet you rather than dropping away. So that was quite a dodgy moment, I'm sure. But there were some really small landing craft that did cross the whole way over. So some of those were towed. So for one example is the LCA brackets HR. So it's HR stood for hedgerow, and this was a converted LCA that had had a number of mortars on it. And the idea was that just literally minutes before the assault troops landed, this is just on the British beaches, British and Canadian, they would fire their mortars, and they would sort of march up the beach, the mortars destroying mines and hopefully hitting the edge of the German beach defences. So these were, I think, were all towed over, which was really pushing the limit of what you could do. They were towed by much larger landing craft, and quite a lot of them, because they're starting to get swamped with water and the tow ropes keep on breaking, they have to make this choice of either they just accept that it's not going to work and they just abandon the landing craft, let it sink, or they have to cast off, and the crew in this tiny little craft that's really not meant to be crossing a significant body of sea have to make their own way, and a number of them are lost, and the crews were killed in the crossing. And then later on, some of the build-up flotillas, so these include, for example, LCVPs or LCM landing craft mechanized, so quite a lot of those manned by Royal Marines. They're coming along end of D-Day and on subsequent days, and a number of those start off and they just can't cope with the sea conditions and have to turn back. But they're actually crossing the whole journey, the whole of the English Channel in these little craft. So they're not going into an assault role at the other end. When they get to the other end, there'll be the idea is the assault's over and they're helping to unload larger merchant ships, that kind of thing. But really it must have been quite a daunting prospect to be heading out across the Channel in this little craft with, as we know, D-Day, the sea was pretty rough.
Isn't the one that sets off on the 5th of June and ends up about a week later turning up on the beach because his tow rope gets snapped, then he breaks down, then he ends up at the wrong beach, and it's like a catalogue of disasters, and then a week later he finally arrives. I've got that right? Have I misremembered?
I think there's quite a few tales like that, not necessarily quite that long, but certainly, yeah, some cases when it does take that long to actually get to the beach where they're meant to, because they don't have any navigational gear, generally these really small landing craft. So the idea would be that they're accompanied by a slightly larger vessel that doesn't always necessarily turn up or meet up with them. So they're just heading out across the Channel, hoping that as they get closer to Normandy, they'll pass another ship going the opposite way that can tell them exactly where they are.
So when it comes to command and control of the landing craft, and presumably they need to be quite tightly controlled, otherwise it would be chaos. I mean, I know we like to think of these things as going in as waves, and I'm sure the first ones do go in as a nice sort of linear wave washing against the shore. But presumably after that, it must get quite tricky to command or control what's happening. How are they doing that?
It would vary depending on different types of landing craft, etc. But the theory was there was some craft that were off the beach, sort of seeing as the different groups of landing craft approached and then directing them, and then other craft that were leading each group of landing craft. It doesn't always quite work that way. But you mentioned waves, so this is a bit of it's a term that's used in a variety of different ways. I suppose its most precise meaning is, as you kind of suggested, a line of landing craft that's hitting the beach so each wave is like a series of waves breaking on the shore, and that often does work essentially like that. Those landing craft might have come from one of the bigger ships. If they're being across the Channel, one of the larger landing ships, they'll be let down into the water carrying their troops. They'll circle around until all the landing craft are ready. Then they'll form a line and head for the beach. So that could be fairly well organised. Once it gets to the beaches, sometimes it can get a lot more chaotic, and particularly on some of the beaches where there's still quite a lot of uncleared beach obstacles, this can make it mean that there isn't space on the beach for the whole group of the whole wave of landing craft to all land at once. So it becomes a lot more a case of sort of milling around, and then a senior officer in a control craft off the shore trying to impose some kind of order. But yeah, a really difficult situation, obviously. A lot of the smallest landing craft wouldn't have had radios, so sometimes it would have been flag signals.
I mean, which somehow seems, I was going to say Victorian, Nelsonian, just standing there with your flag signals, flapping them about.
Yeah, well, I suppose apart from anything else, there would have been so many different waves of landing craft and groups of landing craft that if they were, you'd have needed a lot of channels, presumably, to be really controlling them all by radio. So that's the strict meaning of what a wave was. Obviously, quite often you hear so and so was in the first wave, and things like that. And often that actually what that means is they landed maybe in the first hour or two of D-Day. After a couple of hours, there might have been, I forget, but maybe say 8 or 10 waves. But actually, first wave often simply means early on D-Day rather than literally the very first group of landing craft to hit the beach.
I always think that when you talk about the first or second sort of waves, they're probably quite real. And after that, it just becomes a bit sort of they got there when they got there kind of thing, because there was so much, I don't mean confusion, but there's craft milling about. You have to get through things. So the idea of people, they might have set off in a timed wave, but by the time they negotiate their way to the beach, they land at a certain time is a probably better way of describing when they got there. They might have set off in a wave.
There obviously was a lot of confusion, but equally you don't want to sort of overdo it, sort of exaggerate it. And sometimes I think it does seem like that did work reasonably well in terms of the waves more or less keeping to the timings. In my book, I try for each beach and either describe the plan, what was the sequence of waves arriving at the beach, or if I can describe the plan and then also how it actually worked in practice. So sometimes there's surviving documents that give the actual times for when each wave arrives. Sometimes that's not so clear, and sometimes which landing craft were in each wave isn't quite so clear as well. What I've tried to do in the book is try and put that sequence together as much as I could, so that people have some idea of any particular beach or part of a particular beach, what the sequence of waves would have been and what the conditions were like for them. So there's factors like, as I said, whether the beach obstacles are cleared or not, whether the enemy's still firing directly on the beach, or whether there's more or less aimed indirect fire, for example. So there's all sorts of factors like that, which obviously make it different on different beaches or even on different parts of different beaches. And one thing actually that's really strikes me actually is the number of occasions when if there's still some beach obstacles around, that maybe the tides come in a bit so that they're close to the water's surface, so they're much more of a threat than at the start of D-Day, when generally they're high and dry and not really covered by the sea, so they're not really a problem. And often the landing craft manage to get through the obstacles, so they manage to get up onto the beach and deliver their troops, sometimes with no casualties to the troops. But then it's actually getting off the beach that's the really difficult moment for the landing craft, because I guess it's partly because when you're heading for the beach, you can sort of power through. Often they were going as almost as fast as they could to get as high up the beach as possible to deliver the troops in as shallow water as possible. They've got that speed and momentum when they're coming off the beach. They haven't got any speed, obviously, because they're starting from stationary, and they're having to try and maneuver between all these different obstacles which had mines or shells on them often. And so sometimes, certainly from the point of view of the landing craft and the crews, it's actually coming off the beach that's more dangerous, because they're likely to hit one of these obstacles as they're coming off, or they realize as they start to come into slightly deeper water that they've damaged the underside of the craft going in, and they suddenly realize that often starts leaking in the engine room, which I guess being at the stern maybe was slightly deeper, and then that potentially knocks out the engines. So often it's not quite what you think. They may get to the beach okay, but then it's that moment afterwards, which really illustrates how landing craft are not forgotten, would be exaggerating it, but the sort of fully rounded picture of their experiences, the crew's experiences, is often overlooked, because for most people, when they're considering the story of D-Day, because D-Day was obviously such a big and complex story, the narrative tends to be in terms of the troops delivered to the beach. It's almost like once the troops are delivered to the beach, it's almost like the landing craft then just dematerialise. Don't think about them anymore.
Camera follows the troops up the beach, doesn't steer with the landing craft.
It's important, not just in terms of the experiences of the crews themselves, but also because most landing craft weren't just delivering one load of troops and then going back home, going back to the UK. A lot of them were delivering one load of troops, and then the plan was they'd go back to meet a larger ship, take troops off that or another landing craft, and deliver multiple loads.
I was going to ask about that. So you get off the beach. How long does it take them to get? Because the fleet's some way offshore, so they have to get out, somehow get another load. How long's that circle take to pull off the beach, get more, come back in?
Certainly a good number of hours. The point at which the big landing ships would have anchored ranges from, I think it's about 7 miles to the British and Canadian beaches and up to 13 miles or 11 to 13 miles at the American beaches, slightly further for the American beaches because of the fear of coastal guns shelling the anchorages. So in rough seas with a heavily laden craft would take you quite a number of hours to travel that distance. And also once the little landing craft are launched from the bigger ships, they don't immediately set off. They have to wait until all their wave of landing craft are all ready. So that's more hanging around. They may actually get to the beach a bit early and have to wait a bit before it's their time to go in. And then actually unloading on the beach doesn't always just go like clockwork. It's not just a case of beach, ramp goes down, troops run out in 30 seconds, and we're back off. There's lots of cases of it taking a lot longer. There's a few cases, and again, this isn't something you'd want to exaggerate, or overemphasize, but there's cases of the troops on board being unwilling to go ashore. Clearly, that's definitely no question. It's a minority, but there are some examples where the landing craft are hanging around on the beach because they're waiting for the troops to get off. And particularly, this is not so much for the little landing craft, but particularly, for example, the LCILs, which carrying 200 troops.
Presumably, they have to factor in refueling as well on those small landing craft. They can't be able to do that many runs without needing to take on more fuel as well.
Probably for operating from an anchorage off the coast to the beach and back out again a few times, we're probably okay, I think. And certainly the bigger landing craft could do, like an LCT, could do the UK to Normandy and back and have some to spare.
Visions of sort of having a whole sort of floating petrol station with sort of Higgins boats lining up there, where to be topped up before they can zip off again on a round robins.
This is where the landing barges come in. So the landing barge oil, LBO, was for exactly that role. It had was for refueling landing craft, particularly those that the ferry service, as it was known. So after D-Day, the two landing craft can be split into the shuttle service, what we probably normally think of landing craft doing, going back to the UK, picking up more troops and bringing them over, which was obviously critical. But then ferry service craft are staying over in Normandy, so they're not going back to the UK. They're remaining off the beach for weeks or even for months and helping unloading the big ships. Or, for example, if they're I was talking to an LCF veteran just the other day, actually, landing craft flak. So this was an LCT with anti-aircraft guns the tank deck was decked over, had anti-aircraft guns on there. I think he said he spent something that was 2 or 3 months off the coast of Normandy before going back to the UK, which is not really something we think about in terms of the experiences of maybe naval personnel in general of all sorts. How
did he reflect? Did he think that was a good post D-Day, and presumably it wouldn't be too much of an appalling posting on a flat ship off the coast? I
think it's probably a bit more involved than you might think, because first is the condition, the sort of just basic living conditions. On a small landing craft with quite a lot of troops on it, not necessarily the best rations for that long period. But then a lot of those fighter support landing craft, so things like the LCF and also the LCGL landing craft gun large, which had 2 4.7-inch guns mounted on their decks, so quite a decent amount of firepower for a landing craft. Every night they would form a line down the eastern side of the landings, which was known as the Trout Line. And this was for defence against, particularly, I suppose, air attack as well, but particularly against German surface vessel attacks, which I suppose starts off with things like E-boats, but then as the campaign goes on, it's much more whatever the German equivalent of Heath Robinson is. So things like motorboats loaded with explosives or human torpedoes and all sorts of things like that. I remember hearing one veteran say that he always used to sleep on deck in this period because the risk was so high. Because if one of these hit one of these landing craft, do a lot of damage, sink very quickly, and there could be a lot of casualties, as that did happen in a few cases. So another one of the things I tried to do in the book is try and come up with a few more figures of number of landing craft lost, and particularly looking after D-Day. And it's one of those things where if you look at the total, if you look at the overall percentage, you think, oh, that's quite a small percentage, really. It wasn't really a sort of factor to consider, which from a commander's point of view, I guess was probably right. It was the number of landing craft that lost after D-Day and landing ships as well to any action was comparatively small. But if you're in the crews of one of those, clearly it is a big deal. And the number of landing craft and landing ship personnel who are lost in some months, so it varies in the months during the Normandy campaign, but in the months where it's really high, often it's because there's several LSTs lost, and you could have, I don't know, 40 or 60 plus crewmen from one LST killed in one of those sinkings or one of those actions, for example.
On the day, do they rescue crews, salvage teams, perhaps trying to either pull off or save floundering landing craft and crews?
Or sometimes you had simply landing craft in the same wave that would tow their comrades off. So, whether it's LCTs or LCISs or whatever the other craft in the same flotilla or division would just try and tow off the beach any of their fellow craft that got damaged. But then there are also some, for example, US Coast Guard rescue cutters and other ships that were specifically identified for rescuing damaged vessels. But equally, there would have been quite a lot of landing craft that were left on the beach at the end of D-Day because they'd been abandoned by their crews, but that didn't mean they were necessarily completely lost. And so I tried to come up with some figures for the number of crafts lost or badly damaged on D-Day, which is another really difficult thing. Obviously, if a landing craft sinks at sea and it's gone some depth down, that's lost. But then there were plenty where they were abandoned by their true crews. They'd had quite a lot of damage. They were left on the beach, and that was considered either lost or really badly damaged. But then that didn't stop someone coming along at a later date and actually, when they had more time, putting the work in to patch the craft up, and then it could be reused. So it's almost impossible to have to apply the same kind of standard of loss and serious damage across all the beaches and to make exact comparisons of how many landing craft were lost on each beach. You also sometimes get craft that limp back to the UK with maybe on one engine, one of several engines, or even they've got no engines working. They might be sort of half swamped, and they get back to the UK. So in a sense, you'd think they're back home, so they should count as not lost. But then when they get back home, they're scrapped because they're considered it's not worth putting the time in, which must have been pretty depressing for the crews, having put all that effort in. I can think at least one example of an LCT that had lost its bow door, lost its ramp, and then had to cross the whole of the channel with the sea flooding in onto the tank deck. So which, apart from anything else, really slowed it down, clearly, because it was having all the extra weight, all that water. What that must have been like for the crew, you just can't imagine, because they would have been expecting they could sink at any moment, I should think. But and there's cases where that sort of really, really badly damaged craft do manage to get back home, back to the UK. And actually, there's not that many landing craft that are lost in the sense of they sink off the beaches and they can completely disappeared. But there's a lot more that are damaged to varying degrees. So there's an awful lot of patching up that's done, whether it's sort of small things or bigger damage that happens, not just those that have gone over D-Day, but after D-Day as well. Obviously, beaching a landing craft is something that's potentially quite damaging because you're driving the craft up against the beach. And if you do that repeatedly, you're almost asking for damage. So, repair. And then there's a big infrastructure back in the UK for repairing landing craft that plays a really important role.
What struck me was reading the accounts was how many landing craft do get off the beach. It was incredible. But then they seem to leak like sieves through naturally leaking like sieves, or taking some odd damage, as you say, the bow door's been shut off, or something odd, sort of the winch on one side of the bow door affects it, so it can't pull. And there's just such odd things that you wouldn't necessarily get on a different form of craft. It's just these, as you say, are built to ram the beach with a thing that comes down, which somehow makes them feel unseaworthy.
There's so many little stories or stories of individual landing craft and their crews. Little stories isn't the right way of putting it, but in the massive event that was D-Day, so many examples of individual craft and their crew that I would come across and just thought, people have to hear this story. This is just amazing. And the one that most struck me was, I forget whether it was Utah or Omaha now off the top of my head, but it was on one of the American beaches, and the landing craft, I think it was an LCVP belonging to one of the wave leaders. So he had a wooden sign indicating that he was leading that particular wave. And then when they beached, they took some damage that meant they couldn't, to the underside of the craft, that meant they couldn't just withdraw because they'd have sunk. So they actually used the sign, the wave sign, to repair the bottom of the craft so they could then get off the beach again without sinking. Imagine what it was like for that small group of men who were having to make the decision, like, do we just, it would have been so easy just to abandon their own landing craft, try and get a lift on another one. But they must have had a determination to get their specific craft back off the beach so it could be reused again for future landings, because it would have been drilled into them that they weren't just a sort of one shot weapon. They needed to be used multiple times.
But the one that struck me was the landing craft that gets stuck on the beach and it just can't get off. And they're hoping the tide will eventually free them. So they're waiting for the tide. So they take cover round the engine, figuring the engine will stop any incoming bullets, hopefully. And you think, why do they not take the decision just to abandon the thing, get on something else and get off the beach? But no, we'll stick it out and we'll wait for the tide, which struck me as quite remarkable.
And I'm sure sometimes it must reflect the feelings that the crew had for their own particular landing craft. They might have been serving on board for a shorter or longer time, but often the impression that the crews have when they first see their landing craft is often quite amusing, because there's a bit of seems to be a feeling of being a bit let down. This wasn't quite what they'd signed up for. I mean, because it doesn't look like a more conventional warship, and there's all sorts of rather abusive words that the Navy applies to landing craft. But then over time, they grow to particularly like and love their own particular craft and all its foibles. And clearly, they weren't all happy families, all different crews, but many of them do seem to have got on really well together, because they were a small group of men in a small space. And I suppose if you didn't find some way of sort of reaching an understanding and getting on well together, that would probably have been tricky. But also because of the size of the landing craft, the crews did all have to muck in. So not all on the same equal basis, of course, because you'd have one or two officers, and clearly they were given the orders, so they had to have a higher status. Most of the crew don't just have a single role; they have multiple different roles. And also, there's definitely compared to the bigger warships, definitely quite a large element of informality compared to the bigger warships. So the clothing or lack of that the crews end up wearing is pretty varied. One of my favourite stories is of landing craft crew, I think they were British, when they went ashore in Normandy, actually being arrested by the military police, because what they were wearing just didn't resemble a military uniform of any sort, because they're often doing quite hard physical work, and they seem to have just worn different scraps of uniform or non-uniform, and so probably some of the crew did like that, or did appreciate that sort of informality, I think.
To the Mulberry Harbour, I mean, we've started slightly moving beyond did. I'm so intrigued about how much the Mulberry Harbour's actually, do we know how much of the heavy lifting they did for the landing craft, or did their role just change when the Mulberry Harbours are built to help bring more stuff to shore?
Well, once the Mulberry Harbours get going, obviously there's the storm that disrupts things not that long after D-Day, but even once the Mulberry Harbour, as it was after the storm, is running smoothly, it's not the only way that supplies and troops and vehicles are landed. So there's still plenty of those coming ashore via the beaches. So it does mean that, I guess it's particularly useful probably for LSTs, for example, landing ship tanks, because of the number of vehicles on board, it's inevitably going to take a fair amount of time to unload those. So it's much more efficient to land and cargo of an LST via the Mulberry Harbours when there was no risk of it getting stranded on the beach. Whereas if you're beaching an LST, it's going to take a while to unload. So there's a fair chance that the tide will go out and leaving the ship stranded on the beach. So originally, the sort of official line was that LSTs should avoid beaching like that, drying out on the beach, because of a risk of sort of cumulative damage that could do some kind of structural damage. It seems that they did actually start doing that fairly early on, and actually it wasn't any kind of a problem like was imagined. But yeah, we were doing much faster on loading via the Mulberry Harbours. But there's also, as I said, lots of little landing craft that are just landing over the beaches. A lot of the ferry craft are going out to merchant ships off the shore and having supplies, stores, or vehicles, for example, craned into them, and then they're taking them ashore. And so a lot of those would be going onto the beach.
What were the casualties of crews? Was it high casualty level? Because you did say that not very many landing craft were necessarily lost.
Yes, and no one's, I don't think, has really ever tried to total, or certainly they haven't published the total casualties for landing craft crews on D-Day. They will get mentioned in some accounts as being part of the naval casualties probably. But so I just thought it was useful to try and do that. But it is quite tricky because some records are better than others. And particularly some people are mentioned as landing craft crewmen in the records of, for example, Commonwealth War Graves Commission or the American Battle Monuments Commission, but others are just mentioned as naval personnel. So it's a bit of a work in progress. Currently, know there's at least about 260 landing craft crewmen killed on D-Day, and then throughout the whole campaign, it's looking like it's over 800. The months have the highest figures. Often it's because of an LST being sunk or badly damaged, and that can mean that dozens of personnel are killed just in that one incident. Obviously, smaller landing craft, clearly having smaller crews, even if you lose the whole crew, that might only be 3 or 4 men. So that's across all the Allied forces. So it is a small proportion compared to the total Allied personnel or the Allied land forces personnel. This wasn't something I really started out doing. As I went along, I just started coming across lots of information in wartime records, looking at the modern CWGC or ABMC records for those casualties, and just started thinking, well, these men need to be sort of brought together in some ways. On my website, ddaylandingcraft.net, I've got a roll of honour for landing craft crews, simply to bring all those names together, particularly to make, for a lot of them, as I said, it's in the modern records, if you look at them, it's often not clear that they are actually or were actually landing craft crew. With the American casualties, for example, obviously some of those were repatriated to the US for burial, so they're not in the ABMC records. In the British records, with the CWGC records, for example, quite often it may not have a landing craft number under that individual as the ship they're on, the unit they're attached to. It might just have one of the Royal Navy shore bases, like HMS Copra, for example. There's others as well. If you look at their gravestone, you could at first glance assume that's the ship they were serving on. Actually, it's a shore base that they were attached to for pay purposes, for administrative purposes. It wasn't necessarily even a place that they had actually gone to ever, but it's just what they were under. So sometimes I've come across cases like that. So it's been good to be able to put all that information together, and hopefully it'll be useful for people in the future.
Well, the landing craft wouldn't have had a name because it's not a ship. So presumably that's why they'd be associated with something else. There
are quite a lot of people in the records, the two different countries, or the Commonwealth, British Commonwealth and the US, that do under their unit, it does give a landing craft number. So there are plenty of people who are associated with a specific landing craft or landing ship. But yeah, there's also quite a few where they're not associated with that.
Is there a memorial for them? I'm not quite sure which branch they fall over to put a memorial up for them, to be honest.
Yeah, so there's a few. I believe there's a Combined Operations Memorial at the National Memorial Arboretum, I think. And then at Ouistreham, there's a landing craft cruise memorial. So for many years, there was the LST and Landing Craft Association, which was a British association. And so I think they played a big part in commemorating and recording the memory of the landing craft crews. So just to go off a slight tangent, so their archivist was a guy called Tony Chapman, who spent a lot of time gathering accounts from landing craft crewmen, encouraging them to write their accounts down and putting veterans in touch with each other. And then he passed away quite a few years ago now, and that archive later on came to the D-Day story, came to our museum. And similarly on the American side, quite a lot of American veterans have recorded their memoirs as well, or people have done, obviously oral histories, that kind of thing. So there are quite a few accounts of people out there.
How many British landing craft have survived the war? I mean, I know there's not very many in the US left. Do we have many over here kicking around landing craft? Could they be reused for anything after the war? I don't know if they had a post-war life.
The majority was scrapped after the war just because there were so many that there was just no need for most of them. Quite a lot had a career, the smaller types had a career as houseboats. So even down to the very smallest, like the LCVPs, there's still a few in the Portsmouth area, for example, maybe two or so at least. So they've been built up sort of increase the height of the sides and then had a roof put on. But if you kind of squint at them, you can kind of make out the shape of an LCVP. I think there's an LCIS that's similarly was used as a houseboat as well, that's still around. So there's a few like that. Also, there's still in the US a few that are actually operating still. So there's 2 LSTs, and I think both of those are still operational. So they're now museum ships, but they can still move under their own power and visit other places. And there's even one LST that's still operating as a ferry on the east coast of the US, which I think is just amazing. So it's been quite extensively converted for civilian use, but it's still operating until fairly recently, and they may still be in use. I'm not absolutely sure. There were a few LCTs that were being used as ferries as well, maybe on the Great Lakes and US, places like that. So actually in a similar role to what they would have been used on D-Day, carrying lots of vehicles. So, converting them to civilian use like that, you didn't need to change things too much, I guess. The classic example, though, which I'm involved with through my work, which obviously the book that I've written is outside work, but is related to my day job as the curator of the D-Day story in Portsmouth. So and at the D-Day story, we have LCT 7074. So it's the only surviving LCT, or the only surviving intact LCT that was there on D-Day. And that survived because it had a post-war career, first as a clubhouse. So it was the clubhouse of the Master Mariners of Liverpool. And then after that, as a nightclub, as a floating nightclub. So it survived because it was still being used. So it still meant, people were still looking after it, because it, wouldn't take too long for someone not maintaining a craft like that, and it would start to get quite damaged and potentially sink, and then, on a downward spiral. So there's not too many that still survive. Obviously, there's a few more smaller landing craft around. So if you go around Normandy, you'll see a number of different, there's a few LCVPs certainly, and maybe a few other types. I also don't know the history of all of those, whether they were used in the campaign and then stayed out there, or some of them may have been brought in from elsewhere.
Well, very good. Thank you, Andrew. Loyal listener, Andrew's book is D-Day Landing Craft, How 4,126 Ugly and Unorthodox Allied Craft Made the Normandy Landings Possible. And for his Roll of Honour, Remembering Crews Lost, you can find his website at ddaylandingcraft.net. For patrons of the podcast, look out for a little more from Andrew discussing his day job at the Portsmouth D-Day story. If you are not already a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/WW2podcast, where you will have access to advert-free episodes and short extras when I have them. Well, that is all for this episode of the show. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.